Good morning, everyone. We'll start in just a second or two. We'll let some more people trickle in. All righty, we'll get started here. All right, thank you everyone for being with us today. Um, my name is Ileana Mejia. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the public policy advocate at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. MCN is a nonprofit association representing over 2,200 member organizations across the state. Through MCN, nonprofits join together across interest areas to work on issues of common interest to all. Though we're not the only organization hosting this event today, Minnesota Council on Foundations is our co-host, and we're so grateful for their collaboration with this event. MCF is a statewide foundation association that has membership of both community and private foundations. MCF works to connect, mobilize, and strengthen the philanthropic community. So we came together as organizations to host a really important conversation with the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank to talk about a variety of topics related to the economy. Federal stimulus in response to COVID, changing interest rates, economic disparities around race and gender, and new directions and programs for the Federal Reserve. We do have a little under an hour to have a conversation with both Neel Kashkari and Alene Tchourumoff. Now, before you wonder who they both are, though I hope you already do, I'll read you a little bit of their bio. So Neel Kashkari took office as president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis on January 1st, 2016. In his role, he serves on the Federal Open Market Committee, bringing the Ninth District perspective to monetary policy discussions in Washington, D.C. In addition to his responsibilities as a monetary policymaker, Kashkari oversees all operations of the bank, including supervision and regulation, treasury services, and payment services. Most recently, he has joined with retired Minnesota Supreme Court Justice Alan Page to propose amending Minnesota's constitution to make a quality public education a fundamental right. This effort supports the Fed's mandate to achieve maximum employment, with education being a key to obtaining a good job. Alene Tchourumoff, Vice President of the Community Development and Center for Indian Country Development, leads the bank's engagement with communities throughout the Ninth District to promote economic opportunity for low and moderate income people and those living in Indian country. Key focus areas include early childhood development and affordable housing. Alene was named a 2020 Women in Business honoree by the Minneapolis-St. Paul Business Journal and is a member of the Minnesota State Attorney General's task force dedicated to improving women's economic security. So as a policy nerd, I do love the intersections of those policy areas that you do focus on. So I'm really excited to hear more about that. So with that, I'll get into some housekeeping rules about this event. So Shannon, if you could go to the next slide. I want you to look at the bottom of your Zoom window. To chat during the session, you can click on the chat box to type. The chat tool is where you can send a message to the whole group. Susie, who will be moderating the Q&A portion of this event, will not be able to read the chat during the moderation, but I will be keeping an eye on it. But to ask a question to both Neel and Alene, I would like you to use the Q&A tool. That's where you'll ask questions of our panelists. You can upvote a question that you'd like to see answer as well. Use this function to ask questions and not to chat. If you do pose your question in chat, I'll be checking, but I will ask you to move it over to the Q&A function. Please note that this session does have auto captioning, and you can click on the CC button in your Zoom tools on the bottom of your screen to toggle on or off. Again, Susie Brown, the Executive Director of Minnesota Council on Foundations, will be moderating the questions. And so before we hear from our guests and take some questions, I do want to set the stage. Clearly 2021 and so far the first half of 2020, clearly 2020 and the first half of 2021, and dare I say beyond, were exhausting, overwhelming, and scary, not only for us as individuals, of course, but for our families, jobs, organizations. The nonprofit sector is still grappling with COVID, and nationally, our sector is down 700,000 jobs, though in April there was an increase of about 63,000. It will take yet over another year to get unemployment levels pre-pandemic. Our wonderful advancement and research team at MCN put together 4 economy reports and how COVID has impacted them, has impacted the nonprofit sector. And so I do want to read a few key findings. 1/3 of respondents of our most recent survey said that they have experienced enhanced donations from individuals, grants from foundations or corporations, and government funds. 30% of respondents reported in March 21 that they have less than 6 months before they exhibit financial distress. And the second year of the COVID crisis has shown that nonprofits continue to experience increased demand for services, yet a depressed ability to provide services. And this has been the theme for the last 4 impact surveys. So much more work is needed to be done to make sure our sector is supported along with our community. So before I introduce Neel and Alene, I just want to reiterate thanks to everyone who showed up today on this beautiful Friday morning. Remember to place those questions in the Q&A. I will introduce Neel, and then he will share some words with us, and then Alene will share some words, and then Susie will moderate the questions. And with that, over to you, Neel.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Great to be with you. Appreciate the invitation to join this great group of experts around the state of Minnesota. My name is Neel Kashkari, president of Minneapolis Fed. I'm going to start with just a few comments about the economy to maybe set up our conversation. Obviously, the COVID shock was a tremendous healthcare shock to the United States and to the global economy, and that led to a devastating economic shock with perhaps the deepest recession since the Great Depression. And it came, we weren't expecting it, right? Before the pandemic hit, the US economy was doing quite well. The unemployment rate continued to fall. More and more Americans were finding jobs. And most importantly, from my perspective, we were seeing wages starting to grow most quickly for the lowest income workers because the job market got tight. And that was a really attractive thing. That was really good news. Those were folks who were long overdue for a raise. And then the pandemic hit us seemingly out of the blue, and it disproportionately affected the lowest income workers. And so those are the folks who are the most financially vulnerable, the frontline workers that you all know, and in many cases you all serve through your work. And so the pandemic was deeply, deeply unfair. The people who were least equipped to handle it were the ones that were most disproportionately affected by it. You know, Alene and I, our colleagues at the Federal Reserve, most of us were able to work from home. And so, yes, it was a disruption in our lives, but we were not affected in terms of our economic well-being, though people had healthcare risks. But those workers, either they lost their jobs because their businesses were shut down, or for the frontline workers that managed to keep their jobs, they were the ones put at most health risk because they had to go back to work and interact with the public. And so on many dimensions, it was an unfair crisis. So where are we today? Well, frankly, mostly because the US Congress was so aggressive in providing support to families and the small businesses that were affected by the crisis. We are now in the beginning of what is hopefully a very, very strong recovery, trying to get back to normal, something like what we saw pre-pandemic. And so that's really good news. The Federal Reserve acted aggressively in cutting interest rates to try to provide support to economic growth and economic recovery. And we're now experiencing that recovery as people are going back to work and businesses are starting to return to normal. But we are still in a deep hole. We still have more than 7 million jobs short of where we were pre-pandemic, and even more short of where we should have been. And so while you hear many, many businesses saying we can't find workers, this is a worker shortage, at the same time, there are many Americans that are still on the sidelines. And so I'm paying a lot of attention to try to understand what's going on. Why is it that you simultaneously have businesses saying we can't find workers? And yet when we look at the data, there are many, many Americans who are not working, who should be working right now. So what's going on? This is really important as the Federal Reserve tries to understand what's the outlook for the economy. Now, let me back up for a second. We at the Fed always talk about our dual mandate. This is what the US Congress has charged us to achieve. There are two goals. One goal is maximum employment, as many Americans as possible gainfully employed and participating in our economy. And then stable prices, what we define as 2% inflation, an average of 2% inflation over time. Now, we typically think these two goals are linked like a seesaw, and they trade off each other. As the economy gets stronger, businesses have to compete to find workers. The unemployment rate goes down. Businesses have to pay up to get those extra workers, and then that leads to inflation. And so we typically will adjust interest rates up and down to balance these two sides of the seesaw. Well, right now, we're seeing high inflation readings. You're probably seeing it when you go to the grocery store. You're seeing it when you go to fill up your tank with gas. You're seeing it in the headlines. So that says, wow, inflation is high right now. And yet, it seems like, and you're hearing businesses say we can't find workers. So that's consistent with the seesaw story. But when we look at the data, there's still millions of Americans who are not working. So what's going on? This is kind of a conundrum that we're trying to understand, and it has really important implications for how we assess our two goals and where we end up taking interest rates in the future. Well, we know that some of the inflation readings, some of the high prices we see right now, they're not a surprise. Partly they're happening because a year ago we had plummeting prices because the US economy was shutting down. And so simply as prices return to normal, you would expect high inflation readings. That's just math from a low base a year ago. And then we also know reopening the economy, we shut it down very quickly. Now we're reopening it. That leads to frictions. That leads to shortages as businesses have to reopen. And we know that some of those price increases are likely going to be temporary, just as businesses are adjusting to the reopening. And I'll give you an example. So we saw lumber prices soared over the past year to almost record levels, and now they're not back down to normal, but they're falling back down to earth as the markets readjust and as businesses readjust and things start to normalize. We would expect to see more of these very high readings start to return down to normal. So we know some of this is math based on the data from a year ago. Some of it are temporary adjustment periods as businesses adjust to the reopening. And the key question is, how much of it is based on long-term fundamentals and not just these temporary factors? And that's really, for me, where I then look at the labor market. If the 7 million or 8 million or 10 million Americans who are not working today, if they're never coming back, then that will give me much more concern that these high inflation readings might be here to stay. But I believe they are coming back. One of the things that continued to surprise us year after year after year in the last expansion is every time we thought the US economy was out of workers and wages started to climb a little bit, workers came off the sidelines and they saw their brother or their sister or their neighbor or their friend get a job and they said, wow, that job looks pretty good. I'm going to go get that job. And then they entered the labor force, surprising us positively. And that meant that the US economy's potential was greater. So for me, as a policymaker, I look at the labor market that we had before the COVID crisis hit. And what does maximum employment mean to me? At a minimum, it means getting back there, putting all of those 7 or 8 or 10 million Americans back to work, and maybe going beyond that so we can actually achieve our full economic potential. So what's keeping these 7 or 8 or 10 million Americans on the sidelines? It's at least 3 factors. Number one, we know that childcare is still a profound issue with schools that have been shut. Now we're hoping, should be by September, schools will fully reopen and some of those childcare pressures will diminish. I'm a father now of 2 young children, And my wife and I understand full well if kids are homesick or if schools are closed or if daycare is closed, it produces tremendous pressure on the family and it impacts our ability to do our work. So childcare, number one. Number two, we know that many Americans are still nervous about the virus, right? We spent a year, 18 months warning people how dangerous this virus is. It is really dangerous. And a lot of people are still nervous about getting back on buses, even if they're vaccinated, getting back on buses or going back into crowded areas. And so as the virus hopefully continues to diminish, as vaccines continue to be widespread, I would expect that confidence will start to return and people will feel comfortable going back to work. And then third, we do know that there are generous unemployment benefits that are going to be expiring by September. And it's not crazy to think somebody would do the math. If, well, I can make as much money or more for the next couple months on these generous unemployment benefits, why don't I wait until September? It's likely the job market will be strong in September. So I think all three factors are holding back labor supply. But by September, all three of those factors should really be better. And then we should see a lot more labor supply in the fall. So that's what I'm paying my attention to. And the Federal Reserve has said we're going to keep interest rates effectively at zero until we really achieve maximum employment and until we sustainably have inflation at our 2% target and would expect it to increase over time. And that's what I'm going to be paying very close attention to. So that's just an overview of how I'm seeing the current economy. I was speaking nationally, but everything I said there also applies to Minnesota. Minnesota has a very diverse economy, and in many ways, Minnesota's economy reflects the US economy because all of the major sectors of the US economy are represented here. And so I really look forward to having this discussion, hearing from you, hearing your questions, but also hearing your comments in terms of what you all are seeing in your communities as you work hard to serve the communities that your nonprofits and your foundations work with. So thank you for that. I hope that was a helpful overview. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Alene, who will offer some of her thoughts.
Great, thanks, Neel. I think that you're closing on talking about what's happening in the community is a great transition, actually, to talk about the work of community development. And so Neel laid out the broad picture of the role of the Fed in terms of what our dual mandate is, that maximum employment and stable prices. When we think about the work of community development, really we were founded, probably in the late 70s when Congress created the Community Reinvestment Act, and that was a deliberate act of Congress to remedy the practice of redlining. So we wanted to make sure we had an understanding of what was happening in communities and how banks were serving those communities, especially low and moderate income communities. And so my department and my team from the 70s until now had really been focused on access to credit and really understanding current conditions within low and moderate income communities across the 9th District. And that mandate really has shifted over time from that CRA focus, that access to credit focus, to a more broader focus on that maximum employment side of the dual mandate of what are some of the barriers or conditions in the 9th District that would impact those communities more broadly. And so that's one of the reasons why we focus on early childhood development. About 15 years ago, when we started this area, people were questioning, why would a central bank be interested in what's happening with babies' brain development? And why would we be engaged in that? And our researchers found that that's actually a really important way of thinking about public investment for future workers. So we're looking at the vitality of the region and the economy as a whole, not only today, but also tomorrow and into the future. And so really making sure we're thinking comprehensively about what those factors are. So that's one of the reasons why we continue to focus on early childhood development. Affordable housing, when we go out across the region or across the district, affordable housing comes up pretty much in every conversation, and just housing supply and giving us an opportunity to understand what are some of those drivers and do research and talk with city and other developers around the community to understand what's happening. I think the third thing that we were engaged with the Council of Foundations and Nonprofits in the very beginning of the pandemic, especially to try to understand what some of those real-time impacts were. So giving us the chance to go out and talk to people in the community. How is COVID impacting you and the services that you're providing? How is it impacting the people that you're serving? And then I think so we have the opportunity to try to be responsive to things that are happening in real time. And that's one of the reasons why we launched the Racism in the Economy series last year. Was after the death of George Floyd, we realized that we had a responsibility in some ways to really look at the way that structural racism is playing out, not only for individuals and their families, but also more broadly for the economy. Are we leaving people on the sidelines, as Neel was talking about, all those millions of Americans who are yet back to work? What's maybe stopping their full participation in the economy? So that's kind of a high level overview of the work that we're doing in community development. We also have a Center for Indian Country Development, which is a national resource within the Federal Reserve System. And we've been tracking, especially in the pandemic, real-time kind of feedback from our tribal partners across the country. What are conditions in Indian country? And we've seen, among all of the different outcomes that we're tracking in housing and health and education outcomes and things like that, Native Americans are always, their numbers are always worse than unemployment for Black Americans or unemployment for Latino Americans. So it's something that we pay close attention to, given the fact that there are so many tribal nations in the 9th District, but also more broadly across the country. But I know we want to probably get to Q&A, so I maybe would stop there and be happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you both so much. President Kashkari, who has asked that we call him Neel. So thank you, Neel. And Alene, thank you very much for your comments. And we really look forward to a robust discussion. I want to just start by thanking you for reminding us, educating us about the goals of maximum employment and stable prices, and just how inflation adjustments play into that. I think we probably all have a lot to learn about that. Most of us are not economists on this call. So that's helpful. And I just also want to thank you for this. You did this when you said seesaw, and I think that that helps us understand a little bit about the ways that you push your levers to try to balance that thing out. So thanks for giving us some lay terms and some visuals as we think about this. So we have several questions coming in. I want to start with one that, Neel, you did really, I think, help us understand a good amount about the employment situation, and mentioning that in September, when those extra benefits run out, we're likely to see more people coming into the employment economy. But you also said earlier that this is one of the things that you're all really wrestling with, trying to figure this part out. So somebody has asked a question about the $300 in particular, and I think we hear a lot of things out there on the radio and the news about it, what effect is this having? So is there anything just a little more you could say about that and kind of dig a little bit deeper into that issue?
It's very hard. We've been trying to look at the data to answer definitively how big a factor is it, and we cannot answer definitively. A year ago, when the extra, I think a year ago, was $600, there were already complaints from businesses saying, oh my gosh, we can't find workers. And you just think about it. And when we analyzed the data, we could not see evidence in the data that the extra unemployment benefits were affecting the labor market and labor market supply. And I was not very sympathetic with those views. Let me just say this. Even before the pandemic hit, since I've been at the Federal Reserve, the one constant is businesses always complaining they can't find workers. It's universal. And what I found is that if businesses cannot find workers who are highly trained for their specific job at wages they're used to paying, they immediately declare it's a worker shortage. My gosh, it's a crisis. Now, if the price of oil goes up or the price of corn goes up, businesses say, oh, well, we just got to pay more for corn or more for oil. They're not happy about it, but they get it. That's the market. But if for some reason they don't have a line of workers down the street, it's a worker shortage. I don't know why businesses have this emotional view about wages, but they do. And so I've become a big skeptic of businesses' claims about worker shortages, especially a year ago when we were in the throes of this terrible pandemic. So now, though, when I just think about it intuitively, if I were somebody on unemployment benefits, and it looks like the economy is strong and getting stronger, it looks like there are a lot of jobs available, I'd be pretty confident that 3 months from now, there's still going to be a lot of jobs available. And so if I had this extra benefit right now, it kind of makes sense to me. I probably would hang around for a few more months, enjoy the summer, and then knowing that these benefits are going to expire, then go back into the workforce. So I wish I could give you an answer that was more analytical than what I just did. We've been cutting the data every way we can. It's very hard for us to quantify it right now, but I do believe it is having an effect. Is it a bigger effect than the childcare issues or than the fear of the virus? I don't know. But I think all three of those for different people have real weight.
Thank you. That's helpful and a good reminder that there's just a lot of personal behavior things that affect the economy as well as monetary policy and those kinds of things. I'd like to combine a couple questions, so bear with me here. These are still related to employment. So one of them is about using the tax code. This is from Lee Friedman, JFCS, which I believe is Jewish Family and Children's Service. Is there an opportunity to use the tax code to motivate and reward employers for raising wages for people who are receiving low and moderate wages, or penalize employers for paying exceptionally high compensation? So basically, can you use the tax code to sort of create some equity in employment? But then there's a question that I think is related that's very specific from somebody named JDB, which is specific to low wage earners in the field of healthcare, personal healthcare professionals. And there's a lot of public policy that goes into that. Policy changes in Medicaid and DHS waivers, specifically around is there potential for policy changes to raise wages to a livable level for folks who are working in personal care and healthcare? So I'll leave those two questions there, and you can take them where you care to.
You know, getting wages up is a very complicated thing through public policy levers. So one thing that we do at the Fed is, and I feel very strongly about this, if we can create as strong an economy as possible, that lifts all boats, because businesses have to compete to find workers. And just what we saw in 2018, 2019, the fastest wage growth was with the lowest income workers, which is great. So at a minimum, we need to do that. Now, in terms of other policy levers, whether it's tax code, I'll give you another example, raising the minimum wage. So Minneapolis and St. Paul have voted to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour over time. And they both selected the Minneapolis Fed to do a long-term economic impact analysis of what does it actually lead to. You know, theory says the workers whose wages go up are obviously better off, but if businesses cannot afford to have as many workers, there may be some people who are harmed by this because there might be fewer jobs. So we're going to do a long-term economic analysis on what are the effects of that. The reason I mention that is an alternative plan that some people like is the earned income tax credit, which is if you work and you're low wages, the government will basically give you a negative tax rate, basically subsidize your income, reward you for working to boost it to, you know, a more appropriate level so your family can live on the wages that you're earning. That has the benefit of there's no disincentive that leads to fewer jobs, right? There are fewer downsides. But if you step back and analyze it again, it's very complicated, because if you're an employer, now maybe there's less pressure on you to raise your own wages, because you're like, well, I can pay this person minimum wage, and then I add the earned income tax credit on top of that, and now you have a livable wage hypothetically. So it's weird. It could actually lead to some incentives for businesses not boosting wages as much as they otherwise would. And so the goal of raising wages for lower income people, man, I share that goal 100%. But sometimes when you move one policy lever, whether it's in the tax code or it's in the minimum wage, it may not always work out as cleanly as you think. And so we all have to analyze these carefully to try to design them so they have fewer downsides and more upsides. So I don't know if that helps answer the question. It just ends up being very complicated. But I will say the best thing we can do with no trade-offs is have as strong an economy as possible, a tight labor market as possible, so businesses have to really work hard to find workers. That leads them to raise wages, to invest in their workers, because it's in their own economic interest to do so.
Thank you. And Alene, if you want to jump in on any of these, feel free. I'll just watch to see if you unmute your mic, and if you do, feel free. And I want to just say that the person who asked that question was Jeff Brown from Life Work Services. I'm assuming you're interested in who's on the call. I'll ask another one related to workforce, and that is from Mike Postma from Workforce Development, Inc., which is in Southwest Minnesota. And this is a question about people leaving the workforce the baby boomer silver tsunami, which was exacerbated by COVID. And the question is about immigration. And do you or does the Fed have a point of view on how many people should be allowed into the country to help with the fact that we have people leaving the workforce and, as we've heard a lot about recently, a slowing birth rate. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I certainly have a view, and I've been very outspoken on this very issue. We know that a big source of economic growth, one source is productivity growth, which is we get smarter technology, we can do more with the same resources. Another source of economic growth is simply population growth. More workers to produce things, more consumers to buy things. And just as you said in your question, our birth rate has been declining for decades. And so unless we do something about that, we are going to have slower economic growth than we have enjoyed in prior decades. So what do? And we're not the only country for whom this is true. This is basically true in all advanced economies. Well, this is just math. You've got three choices. You can either subsidize fertility, and usually people laugh when I say that, but Japan is trying this to give economic incentives to Japanese families to have more children. It's very hard. It's not clear if it works. And even if it does work, it takes 20 years to produce a new worker, just to state the obvious. You can subsidize fertility, number one. Number two, you can embrace immigration, which has been true for America over our history. It's been a huge driver of economic growth. Or three, you can accept slower growth. That's math. And so it's up as a country, we have to decide which of those three options we want to accept. Now, I can tell you subsidizing fertility is very difficult and very expensive if it works at all. And accepting slower growth stinks. So if it's my vote is we got to have an immigration system that meets the needs of our economy. And so I think immigration is going to be enormously important to having strong economic growth for Minnesota and for the nation going forward. And if it were up to me, if I were king, I would design our immigration system to match up with our economic needs, as many countries have done, and say, we're going to have more demand to come to America than perhaps our politically will accept. So let's tailor it to meet the needs of our economy. And my parents are immigrants here from India. My wife is an immigrant from the Philippines. I mean, I think I'm biased, obviously. I think immigration has a really important role to play, but this is really now about the politics of it, not about the math or the economics.
Can I tie in just a little bit about the kind of the integration of immigrants into our community as Neel's made a kind of a broader point about their benefit, just kind of from an economic growth standpoint. But I also think, as I think Neel and I are both children of immigrants, how quickly do we accept and help new immigrants integrate into the U.S.? I mean, obviously, I think it happens really quickly with children, but I think that's also part of maybe the role of nonprofits and philanthropy within a community, is making sure that we have the right support systems and structures in place to really help them transition into life in the United States.
Thanks. I really appreciate you bringing in what our role is, because we're here to not just have an interesting public affairs session, but to actually learn things to help us think about our work. So I want to appreciate that. I also want to share that nonprofits in particular, and philanthropy to some extent, are very good at advocacy. And so that is another area, because this is obviously a policy question and a political one at that. But there certainly are many nonprofits that are very interested in immigration as a policy issue, and certainly working on that. I'd like to stay with another question related to your goal of maximum employment, and that is about guaranteed income. St. Paul and some other communities are experimenting with cash payments to low-income families. Maybe this is somewhat related in your mind policy-wise to their earned income tax credit. But could you just comment a little bit on the policy concept and the practical implications of guaranteed income?
Well, I think it's related to the discussion we had a few moments ago about the unemployment benefits, right? There's great concern that enhanced unemployment benefits create a disincentive to work. If you now make them permanent, then that would make that disincentive to work permanent. And so to me, pairing it with a work requirement would eliminate that disincentive effect. And so it ends up being much closer to the earned income tax credit than it ends up looking like unemployment benefits. I mean, I'll tell you this, I spent a lot of my time since I've been at the Minneapolis Fed traveling around and visiting tribal communities and going to reservations with our Indian country experts that we have at the bank. I can't tell you the number of times that tribal leaders have said to me, these aren't nonprofits saying this to me. These aren't white people saying this to me. These are tribal members saying this to me. We need to do something about the culture of dependence in our community. They say it and they see it. And so I am sympathetic with the fear that if you put out some of these incentives in perpetuity, that it can actually lead to complications down the road. And so to me, I think there's great dignity in work. I think there are huge benefits to society when more Americans are working. I think there are benefits to the individual. And, you know, we talked about retirees a moment ago. One of the surprises for us in 2017, 18, 19, a lot of people that we expected to retire chose not to. They said, you know what, this is actually a pretty good work environment, pretty good job environment. What am I going to do sitting at home? You know what, I'm going to keep working. And maybe I'm not going to work 40 hours a week. Maybe I'll work 30 or 20. But I think there are just enormous benefits for everybody the more people are working. And so I would just encourage whatever we do, design it in a way that encourages people to work.
I think, and I wanted to also offer, for the city of St. Paul in particular, they're working on a long-range study to see what the impacts are of their guaranteed basic income program. And, you know, to the extent that it supports household financial stability and things like that, I think those are the stated objectives of the program. The only other consideration I might flag is just, does it impact other benefits that those families might be receiving? Do they kind of fall off of a potential benefits cliff if they get an extra $500 a month? And so you might give them an extra $500 in cash, but they might have a reduction in other benefits of $300. So maybe it's just a net increase of $200. So those are, I think, things that it gets really complicated kind of quickly. And I think they're things that are important to understand long-term.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really important consideration, especially because some of the other benefits are state or federal, and those cliffs don't necessarily line up. So thanks for that. Neel, you mentioned Indian country, and I would like to maybe just shift to a couple of questions that we have related. One is, how do the unemployment and inflation trends in Indian country compare to other parts of the US? And then there's a couple other questions I have here about what tools is the Fed able to access to impact employment in tribal communities? And what prospects does the Fed have for employment in urban and rural tribal communities? So can you talk a little bit about that, please?
I'll start, then I'm going to turn it to Alene, who oversees our work in that area. Structurally, unemployment in tribal areas are much higher than the rest of the country. I mean, multiples. Could be, you might have unemployment of 5% in Minnesota, and you might have 30% in some tribal areas or higher. And these are very complicated structural issues, starting with education, lack of quality education for so many Native kids, both in the cities, but also especially in the tribal communities, lack of healthcare, lack of quality healthcare, lack of transportation. I mean, there are many, many structural factors. I mean, I've gone and visited, I remember I visited a tribal college in Montana, and just a little anecdote, and they were very proud of their automotive repair program. You could get a certification to be an auto mechanic. And so I toured it, beautiful, great. And I asked them, and I said, great. So when you have people who first of all, I asked them about the graduation rate. The graduation rate was like 7% in 2 years, 14% in 4 years. So very low success rate. I said, okay, but if you look at the folks who do graduate, tell me, where do they go work? You know what they told me? Oh, they really can't, because there are no auto car companies on the reservation. And I was like, well, what in the world are you doing? What is the point of this? And so the challenges are multiple layers in terms of, you know, some folks desire to want to stay on the reservation, the lack of business opportunities on the reservation, lack of access to quality education, lack of access to healthcare. And so the unemployment rate is always much, much higher. And it's something we're very focused on, but these are vexing, long-lived challenges. But Alene, maybe I can turn it to you.
Yeah, so I mean, I would agree with what Neel was saying. I think unemployment rates are always higher, but it also just a reminder that unemployment is counting people who are looking for work. And I think we often see in tribal communities that people have just given up. And so that you might see a larger percentage of the overall population who's not working, but they're not counted as in the unemployment rate. To this point, we just launched kind of a labor market dashboard for American Indians that I just dropped into the chat. So to try to illuminate and highlight some additional data of what's happening, particularly in this area. But I think some of the points that Neel raised just in terms of education and educational outcomes, we see those in particular in Minnesota as being particularly terrible, and outcomes for Native American students are worse than Black students and other minority students, just kind of across the board. And so this is something that we've spent a fair amount of time, and I think somebody started in the introduction talking about Neel and Justice Page's initiative to a proposal to amend Minnesota's constitution to provide quality education to all public school students. And that's really part of what drives that initiative, is really thinking about the tremendous disparities that we have in educational outcomes across the board for minority students and also for low-income white students. And so you think about, I'm tying workforce outcomes to education because it really kind of starts there and then ultimately manifests later in people's ability to participate fully in the economy.
And just to add to that, thank you, Alene. When Alan, Justice Page, and I went to, it's called the MIAC, the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council. It's 11 of the tribes, government body. They all convene to negotiate essentially with the state government. We went and presented the amendment proposal to them to seek their feedback, their input. It was remarkable. I mean, in one meeting, unanimous endorsement of the amendment because they all intuitively knew. We didn't need to explain to them the educational opportunities that their kids are getting today. And that if they really wanted to change lives and change it generationally, it really does start with education. And so I'm glad Alene brought that up.
Thank you both. I know that earlier you said you were interested in observations and comments in addition to questions. So there was a comment and it disappeared. So I don't know who said it, but so if you want to say in the chat who you were, go ahead. But this person was observing that they thought that the data showed that a basic income program in, I think it was Stockton, California, proved to be successful. And the comment was, wouldn't it be better to have a single source as opposed to parsing out the sources through the Child Care Assistance Program and MFIP and things like that? So if it did disappear, if the person who made that comment wants to clarify, I can try to be a little bit more clear and say it again. Meanwhile, I'll ask a question. It's a little bit related to one we talked about before with personal care attendants. This is from Julie Manwaring from VOA Minnesota, and this is about employment that is based on Medicaid and Medicare reimbursement rates. And these would be providers in organizations like VOA. So what are your policy thoughts about the fact that these reimbursement rates are persistently too little, that the organizations providing these employment opportunities are not getting reimbursed in a way that is working for them?
Well, I don't have specific thoughts. I mean, I think this is really a point of dialogue between the providers and the government, the fiscal authorities, whether it's state or federal government. I guess in this case, it's federal government, and saying, hey, we can't meet the needs. We can't meet the policy objectives of what you're trying to achieve at these reimbursement rates. And I think that ends up being a negotiation between the providers and the federal government. And so, I accept the comment at face value. I'm not pushing back at all. There's not a role for us to play in that.
Thank you. You've mentioned childcare a couple of times, both as a policy issue and as a personal family issue. There's a question here from Denise Mayotte from the Sheltering Arms Foundation, which does a lot of work with early childhood programs. What do you think the prospects are for the childcare industry in Minnesota? Federal funds have been helpful, but they aren't adequate to meet the need.
Well, childcare is a very, I've studied it now because, it's a very complicated issue, turns out. Because on one hand, you hear families across Minnesota and across the country saying, oh my gosh, you can't get affordable childcare. And on the other hand, you look at wages for childcare workers and they're very low. So wait, what's going on? How are these two things happening at the same time? And the issue is that, unlike any other service, just about any other service, if I go and hire a lawyer to write a will for me, that lawyer might make more money than me, but I only need to hire him or her for an hour or two. But in childcare, every hour that I work, I need someone taking care of my children. So it ends up being a slice of my income has to go to that person, and they effectively become my employee. And so you end up needing a lot of gap between the wages of the childcare worker and the family in order for this to work. You actually need a lot of income inequality, curiously, in order for this to work in the private sector. And so a lot of families are facing tough choices. And the choice is, do I want to give most of my income to this other person to take care of my child, or should I just take care of my child myself? Right? It ends up being a wash. And if it ends up being a wash, I might as well do it myself. And so this is a very complicated issue. And, the only way to reconcile it is if the government basically taxes those people who do not have children to subsidize those who do have children. And that's a policy choice as a country, for us to make to try to reconcile this issue. But it's very complicated. And the one thing that is very clear to me in the data, focusing on early education for kids of low-income families, that provides the overwhelming return on our buck in terms of taxpayer dollars spent. My wife and I have a lot of resources. We're both highly educated. We are making sure that our children get intensive early childhood. Every day we're talking the alphabet, we're talking the numbers, we're talking shapes, we're talking colors to make sure that our kids are getting the stimulus that they need. Not every family is as fortunate as ours. And so I'm giving you a very long answer to a very complicated question, but I would just boil it down to this: focusing our resources on those families that are not as fortunate as mine to make sure their kids get that early education from birth. That's where we're going to see the bang for our dollars in terms of payoffs for those families and for society in the future.
Thank you. I would like to shift us to a little talk about housing. We have a couple questions here. One is from Suzanne Keplinger, who's with the Minneapolis Foundation, who's just interested in generally hearing more about homelessness and lack of affordable housing as a key factor in the overall recovery. But I'll maybe augment Suzanne's question with a couple of specifics. So one of your goals is to keep prices stable. So the housing market and many aspects of it seem to be really not stable. As you mentioned earlier, construction prices, mortgage interest rates have changed a lot. There's an eviction moratorium that is expiring. And so what are the ways that housing costs and investments, whether it's home ownership or rental, can be kept stable in this economic environment? So a few things related to housing and homelessness and how you're thinking about it in terms of the economy.
Well, let me start, and then I'm going to turn it to Alene, who has a lot of experience in this area. We know right now the housing market is booming, and it's in part booming because the Federal Reserve is providing a lot of stimulus to the economy. One of the ways that monetary policy works is we lower interest rates, it lowers the cost of getting a mortgage, it makes it cheaper for families to go out and buy a house. That encourages home renovations, that encourages construction of new homes. Then you end up hiring people, and it's a big boost. We could see it directly between monetary policy and the housing market. So we know that housing is booming in part on purpose because we're trying to get the economy back to full strength. But that's also what I would consider to be a short-term factor. Long-term, we know everywhere I go, when I travel around our region, affordable housing is a huge challenge. And we know that this is a structural challenge. This is not just about where interest rates are today or last month or next month. This is a long-term issue. And the simple fact of the matter is we are not building enough supply to meet the needs of our growing population and our growing population, our growing workforce. And so we need to build a lot more supply so that people have choices, so that we don't just have an escalation year after year after year. And this is widespread. And so let me just say that, and I'm going to turn it to Alene, who can offer a lot more, and I may follow up after Alene.
Yeah, I was actually going to offer just kind of simply, we need to build more. And I don't think it's something that we can recover from just right away, that we've been chronically not building enough housing supply and not supporting enough supply for a while. And so just to try to turn that on overnight is going to be difficult. I think that's one of the reasons why we've been looking, and we're supporting the city of Minneapolis now, looking at the long-term impacts of the elimination of single-family zoning in the city. And that's really one way to kind of intensify land use so that you have the opportunity to turn, single-family homes into triplexes. Similarly, in California, we were kind of watching the proposal to eliminate single-family zoning statewide, which would have been, I think, kind of interesting. But so I think that that's an important part. One of the things that we were trying to explore in the housing session for racism in the economy as well is to not ignore the role that federal programs, practices of redlining, restrictive covenants for specific groups of people, what role that had in shaping our communities and the housing market in our communities. So I think it's important to kind of think about the big picture, but then also remember the historical patterns and some of the specific actions that we took that intentionally segregated communities or blocked people from building intergenerational wealth or building wealth through homeownership at particular periods in time.
And let me just add, this is a space where I think you all actually could play a really big role, which is so often the solution that people look for is, oh, we just need some more money from the government to build a few more subsidized homes. There's not enough money. Like, the needs are so vast. When you hear someone says, oh, we got $50 million more from the state, and now we can go build whatever, 1,000 additional units. That is a grain of sand in the needs of Minnesota in terms of families that are struggling with affordable housing. The only way to solve this problem is by creating the right environment so the private sector can come in and build a lot more supply. And that's why when Alene talked about the 2040 plan and eliminating single-family zoning, that is focused on eliminating one of the barriers to the private sector stepping in, because only the private sector can move at the scale that is actually of this problem, the magnitude of this problem. Again, going back, well, we got a grant for this many, 10 more units or 100 more units. I mean, that's wonderful for those 10 families or those 100 families, but it's a peanut compared to the scale of the actual problem. And so when you see high prices, I look at that and say, okay, why aren't developers seizing the opportunity to take advantage of those high prices and build more and make good profits off of it? And the answer is there are 100 local regulations and local barriers that prevent people from building more. And so we got to look in the mirror. A lot of it is ourselves. I live in a community that has big lot sizes. That's a barrier. So I'm part of the problem. And we need to look at each other and say, what are we all doing individually? When somebody says, well, we're going to build an apartment building in your neighborhood, and you and your neighbors go crazy. Oh my gosh, you're going to change the culture of our neighborhood. You are contributing to this problem. And we got to look in the mirror and realize that we are all at fault here, driving up home prices and making this unaffordable for the lowest income Minnesotans.
Thank you. I'm going to end with a question, not by Cheryl Moeller, but I would like you to know, Neel, that Cheryl Moeller is a Illini engineering alumni like you, and she says hello. I'll just say that. I'd like to end on in the nonprofit sector and philanthropy, and I sincerely hope the community at large. We've been in a moment of racial reckoning and looking in the mirror and exploring opportunities to advance racial equity and justice. And it's so important. And I would like to ask both of you to reflect on or share with us, how is the Fed thinking about racial equity, racial justice in terms of its role in the community, but also economic policy? And then in particular, there's a question from Don Fulton about reparations, which some folks in philanthropy and in the nonprofit sector are talking seriously about and starting to do. So it's kind of a wide open question, but a very serious, important issue for our sectors right now and our community at large. So maybe I can open it up to both of you as kind of the closing question.
You want to start, Alene?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think we're thinking about this in a number of ways. One is about, I think, how we started this conversation, where we think about the role of maximum employment and making sure that we are as inclusive as possible in who wants to participate and who wants to get a job. So I think that it's really important for us to have that in mind as kind of the North Star or the guiding principle of what makes us all better. And I think Neel talked about this before, is how do we lift all boats? But I think particularly in our district, if you look at the outcomes, we have some of the worst outcomes in the country. We have the fourth largest homeownership gap between Black Minnesotans and white Minnesotans in the country. And I think we think of ourselves as this highly progressive place where we try to be inclusive, but we actually have some pretty terrible outcomes and a high quality of life, but we look at across like education, employment, housing. So it's really, I think, important for us to understand, again, the historical context for how we got to where we are today, and then think about what we can do going forward. And that's really why we launched the series on racism in the economy. It's really about not just looking at that historical context, knowing the history is important so that we don't repeat it, but then also looking specifically to advance ideas, policy solutions that might ultimately change outcomes. And so one of the proposals that we brought forward from Evanston, Illinois, was about reparations and housing. And some might argue that that's not real reparations. Real reparations needs to be at the federal level for the abrogation of responsibilities of 40 acres and a mule, or whatever the proposal is. But I think that actually there's a lot of innovation that can happen at the municipal, state, and nonprofit level. If we think about how deliberate we were in our exclusion of people and the ability to access credit, to live in certain neighborhoods, we're really deliberate about being exclusive. And so I think in order to change our outcomes going forward, we need to be as deliberate about being inclusive. And I really do think that the nonprofit and philanthropy sectors have an opportunity to really think hard about that, about how to change outcomes going forward. So I'll pause.
I would just add, going back to the amendment that we've proposed with Justice Page, creating a civil right for every child in Minnesota to receive a quality public education, and then make delivering on that right the state's highest priority. That's the most powerful thing that we could come up with so far that could really change the trajectory of this state. I'm just going to say something. I've been in Minnesota for 5.5 years. This state is great at talking about equity. It's unclear to me if we're actually serious. Great at talking about it. I'll give you an example. One of my colleagues shared with me. African-American gentleman lives in a nice neighborhood. Every sign in his neighborhood every house has Black Lives Matter signs. And there was a proposal to expand the neighborhood school to serve, because it's a really good school, to serve more kids from surrounding neighborhoods. The same families rose up and said, absolutely not. You're going to change the culture of our school. But they all have Black Lives Matter signs. And so, we got to look at ourselves in the mirror. We're great at talking about equity. Are we in fact serious? I don't know. I hope so.
Thank you. It's an important reminder. All of us look in the mirror, do the work that we can do, focus on this, be about action and not just talk. So thank you so much for that. We're at the end of our time together. I want to really sincerely thank Neel and Alene for your time today and your partnership with the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. And thanks to MCN team and all of the MCN members for being partners with MCF on this event. I know that we can all find you on the internet, and I would suggest that participants today, take a look at the Minneapolis Fed's website. You'll see some of the things that Neel and Alene referred to today, additional opportunities to learn. And we really just appreciate being with you here this morning for this town hall. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having us.